Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, the UK is trying to relive its glory days with an outbreak of meningitis B. UTIs may be an overlooked risk factor when it comes to dementia, although we're not quite sure what your penis or vagina has to do with becoming debilitated in your elderly years, but we'll find out as we go. Cannabis may be useful for fatty liver disease, according to a study. A neuroscientist who has had an interesting career path has now lost their memory after being hit by a pigeon while on their motorbike. The keto diets supposedly have more health benefits than you would think, but in my studies. Sharks are testing positive for both cocaine and caffeine in the Bahamas, more than likely annoying several of the drug cartels. Someone has mistaken their history when it comes to the UK, and particularly which King Charles we're talking about. The police are misconstruing who it is that should be charged with something. In America this time, where a quadruple amputee is apparently armed and dangerous. Pi Day has come and gone, and there are at least a few interesting outcomes from this. CERN is transporting antimatter through Europe, and we're fairly sure they're going to try and recreate what America did over Nagasaki and Hiroshima, understanding that Germany surrendered in 1945, and so this is completely unnecessary. And an example of using the right tool in the right way for the right purpose, when it comes to AI at least. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with the UK trying to relive its imperial glory days, where there was an empire in which the sun never set, with an outbreak of meningitis B. We're being a little facetious, but at least the last part of that is true. A meningitis B outbreak in the United Kingdom, particularly in Kent. Why this is and how this is at least partially able to be answered. Meningitis is somewhat contagious, but it does require close and prolonged contact with individuals who are infected. For example, in a sporting event, in a home, in a school, there are various places where you are in reasonably close and prolonged contact with other individuals who would therefore be infected. The symptoms start fairly quickly. They start with a fever, then a severe headache, a stiff neck, sensitivity to light, vomiting, confusion, and a rash. If you are diagnosed early and treated with antibiotics, you should come out fairly fine. But the name for this is a dead giveaway as to why prolonged infection is a bad thing. Meningitis. Meningitis refers to inflammation of the meninges, the layers of tissue that surround the brain and protect it. Once they become inflamed, well, they're more porous to start with, but also they begin to experience edema. Edema, or otherwise known as swelling. The swelling is not good for your brain. Your brain is squishy and does not take well to anything pushing on it, especially not pushing on it in all directions. The other thing here is that this should not be happening. And we want to be very clear about this. There is no reason why meningococcal B should be causing meningitis. There is a vaccine available. There is a very effective vaccine available. And it is widely available in the UK. We presume without any cost given they have an actual healthcare system, unlike America. But no. Somehow or other, this has happened in Kent. And we're presuming here that Kent is one of those anti-vaxxer strongholds, in which natural selection has yet to take its course of action and to wipe them out, which is also unlikely given that, unfortunately, this is treatable. So, yes, the UK is reliving its glory days of disease and death, or at least hospitalization. In similar news, we have a hospitalization for tetanus in Spain. No, it's not. The tetanus in Spain is found mostly on the plains. Tetanus is found in this case mostly in a teen. And unfortunately, it was, a teen who should have been vaccinated, but didn't. Admittedly, the infection is a result of falling and developing a fracture, so that's one thing, but the other is it's from Catalan. And Catalan has its own unique social, cultural, and very much political issues going on. So, we should first ask, why in the hell the family rejected the immunization process? Again, Spain has a fairly effective social healthcare system, and the tetanus vaccine has almost no side effects to speak of, other than, not being hospitalized for infection. So what the hell happened here? And especially considering that tetanus is one of those conditions that once you're infected and it's properly developed, you're kind of fucked. There are a raft of symptoms that are so famous that there's literally art of them. People arcing their back in such a way that it looks like they're going to be snapped in half because of how tetanus causes muscles to spasm. Yeah. So this raises more questions than it does answers, but, thankfully, the individual appears to have, succeeded. Mostly anyway. The kid survived, which is good, but the kid has survived and may not learn his lesson given he's a teenager. Going on now, we have UTIs, which are another teen concern, although also for most other, demographics, but curiously enough, at least in terms of chlamydia, UK visitors to Spain have a higher rate. So there is still some continuity of topics, and more so in the UK, which is an aging population, and the risk of increased dementia. Dementia is hardly a single cause condition. This is just not ever going to be the case with it. It's a complicated disease, many things that play a role, but it's effectively that the brain starts shrinking. Researchers from Helsinki in Finland have found that severe urinary tract infections and some other bacterial diseases are associated with high risk of developing dementia years later, and this is supposed to be independent of other conditions, which, again, referring you back to the earlier point about meningitis, and that you start poking holes in the blood-brain barrier, or the meninges, and you have increased porosity and other damage associated with that. And no wonder you'd have higher risk. But then again, other conditions like heart disease and diabetes also increase the risk, so it's not yet a helpful discovery in any serious sense of the word. The researchers were looking at a largish study size, 62,000 people in Finland aged over 65 who were all diagnosed with late-onset dementia in the last 3 or so years, comparing this to about 313,000 control participants without dementia. They matched them by age and sex, so that's a very strong study designed to start with. They found that there were 29 hospital-treated diseases that connected the two. These included things like mental conditions, behavioral issues, cardiometabolic and digestive diseases, but only 2 types of infections, UTIs and bacterial infections, which does poke some holes in other theories about dementia, but that's a separate problem again. The research is mostly correlatory at this point, as in it's established that there's an association, we just don't know if it's causative exactly. But there is a solid foundation to think there is. As mentioned, infection leads to inflammation leads to brain damage via various mechanisms. But this research is not definitive yet. Going on now, we have medication news that's more curious than anything else. If you are going to take something like Wegovy or Ozempic, you may want to consider which of these you're going to be using, because apparently Wegovy has a higher risk of developing sudden sight loss than Ozempic does. Now, theoretically, the two of these are actually the same thing. They're meant to be the same thing. It's effectively a glucagon-like peptide that just tells the body, hey, you don't actually need to do these things, how about you not make fat? In a nutshell. So, when you look at this, it stands to reason, after all. If you're diabetic, not making energy and various other things is going to help your body maintain sugar levels. If you're fat, well, it stops developing fat. The research comes out of Canada and it analysed records from the US Food and Drug Administration over the last 7 years, or thereabouts anyway, and they found that there were cases of ischemic optic neuropathy, a rare condition which causes sudden and complete vision loss. There's just blood flow that doesn't get to the optic nerve, and if it's sustained, well, you're not blind temporarily, you're blind permanently. They found that the link is very clearly. Wegovy is at much higher risk of causing this than Ozempic is. So this raises a simple question. Why is it happening? What about diabetes in particular protects individuals from going blind when they're taking what is, for all intents and purposes, the same medication? And note, it is a much higher risk for those on Wegovy, up to 5 times higher the risk of developing this condition. There's a significant risk factor there, and one that really should be looked into more closely. Obviously, they're trying to. Understand, we say 5 times, it's not quite, but we'll just use round numbers to make this video easy for everybody. The problem we have for everybody, including ourselves here, is that there's no link that's been established. Again, we go back to the whole correlation and causation thing, but, well, it does raise some pretty serious questions. In further treatment news, we have cannabis, but specifically certain cannabis compounds may help with fatty liver disease, which does seem, let's say, counterintuitive, given that cannabis tends to cause the munchies, and eating anything high in fat can then cause fatty liver disease, along with high sugar and similar. So it would presumably be that, well, if you have the munchies, you're more likely to develop fatty liver disease. Not that the cause of the munchies, the cannabis, decreases it. So this is counterintuitive. Scientists at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel found that both cannabidiol and cannabidiol, CBD and CBG, can improve blood sugar control, reduce liver fat, and lower blood lipid levels in obese mice. There's the answer. Rodent-based studies. Anything in a rodent may not, if ever, translate to an actual human study. So yes, this may be the case, and depending on where in the world you are, you may or may not be allowed to actually go and test it, because for some reason, certain universities get very touchy about the idea of giving people cannabis for free during various experiments. It's annoying, but it's a thing that just happens. They seem to think that there's some issue with who's going to volunteer with such studies. The theory at the moment is that the mechanism underlying this owes to the way the liver develops or uses energy and liposomal function. Theoretically, the two metabolic pathways that are interfered with contribute to improved liver lipid handling, and then as a result, the liver doesn't develop fatty liver disease. That is it in a nutshell anyway, again. That, if it's true, may prove useful? May, and this is a big catch here. Mostly owing to one simple factor here: rodent-based studies, and a lack of human-based evidence. So, we're not entirely confident that this would actually work. In a demonstration of exactly this sort of thing, we have medical cannabis and various mental health disorders. A large medical cannabis review has found that, for all intents and purposes, giving cannabis for all mental conditions does not work. It doesn't matter if it's anxiety, psychotic disorders, or PTSD. It would appear that cannabis does not work. We will, however, say, and this is very important, there are 2 problems with it. One is it's a review, so it basically takes all the existing literature, lines it all up neatly, and goes, okay, this is what the totality of the evidence shows. The second issue is the size of the evidence available. It's about 2,500 participants across 54 randomized controlled trials between 1980 and 2025. So 45 years of research, 54 studies, and about 2,500 people. That's not great, to say the least. And it would explain why the evidence is relatively weak, because you don't have a lot of evidence, in summary. Sure, it seems like it's a lot, but it's really not. Consider, for example, the previous mentioned examination of the things like ozempic or Wegovy, and the numbers involved there, or the role of, say, UTIs and similar. All these things in totality show that there is a larger study size required for anything to be sufficiently sized for, well, to be frank about it, meaningful results. This is more true in this particular review, where it's trying to examine other conditions as well: ADHD, bipolar, OCD, and even tobacco use, where they didn't have enough data to actually produce meaningful conclusions of any kind. So that's another issue, and of course the duration of follow-up. A lot of these studies really didn't follow up at all. Sure, they did do some, but a month is not really able to tell you much of anything. So this is obviously a strong sign that much of the claims around cannabis and its success in treating various conditions is either going to be anecdotal or exaggerated. Going on now, and at least in terms of neurological news, we have a weird development for a neuroscientist, who, as we've mentioned at the start of the video, had a curious career path. They began, obviously, as a neuroscientist, then became an OnlyFans model, and now is a role model as to why it is you do not try and run into pigeons while riding your motorbike. The 25-year-old turned OnlyFans model, and now a role model of losing your memory, well, that is their entire pathway so far. Now, we're not going to, take much time to go on about the role of OnlyFans and the curious reasons as to why you might turn to that from being a neuroscientist, but more to the effect of as to what's actually happened. The woman claims to have been a biker all her life, but she also happened to go out and buy a $100,000 Porsche Taycan Turbo. Once she became successful, I guess is the word for it. And we're going to make the simple argument of anybody who goes out and buys a very powerful motorbike, especially at such a young age, is setting themselves up for grief. We would have honestly expected something like an accident involving slipping, falling, having hit a car, or a car hitting them, things like this. Not a random pigeon running into them, knocking them off their bike, and causing them to lose all their memory. Which, this is just a bizarre series of events. We also presume that their OnlyFans base is probably going to change rather substantially. There's some people with a much more a particular interest, let's call it. In news that is tangentially related to OnlyFans, we have vasectomies. But that for some bizarre reason, during March there is a surge in vasectomies, or at least during major basketball events there is. We're assuming, for some reason, that at this time of year, men get in their mind of, hey, watching balls all the time has given me this thought that perhaps mine should be isolated. Or possibly looking at the very tall people playing on the court and they're thinking, I feel kind of inferior. I better make sure I don't procreate for the betterment of the species. Okay, that's probably not true, but there is definitely a trend here. According to data from US insurance claims databases, during March, which is when the NCAA March Madness basketball tournament takes place, vasectomies see sudden and notable increase in occurring. The data is from over 8 years, and it could actually just be a much more practical thing than everything we've mentioned. Men tend to schedule a vasectomy at this time because it's easier for them to take 2 or 3 days off after the procedure now than it is at other times of the year. So it's really just a pragmatic decision. But it's much more interesting to conflate the correlation of these two events than actually say they have no causative relationship whatsoever. There's also another, let's call it, time of the year when this occurs fairly regularly, but it has nothing to do with basketball. Rather, it has to do with American healthcare and how their insurance system works. Specifically that at the end of the year, the rate of vasectomies increases notably, most likely because at that point the deductible basically reaches its peak and insurers will now start covering a significant greater share of medical costs, meaning that something like an elective vasectomy is actually much cheaper. Perhaps we should call this a lack of Christmas gift. In news related to those who are probably going to be towards middle-aged and thinking of trying to make their life better, because they're sad and desperate to try and get attention from someone younger, or possibly their wife, keto dieting. But specifically, it claims that keto dieting has a benefit, but only if you're a middle-aged mouse trying to impress the female mice. Keto diets are, for all intents and purposes, just consuming primarily protein and not carbohydrates. It's not that amazing, it's actually kind of useless for most people, and in broad terms, most studies would have found that it's practically useless except for kids with epilepsy. We're still not quite clear on how that works, but the research is fairly consistent. Epileptic children benefit from the keto diet. The researchers who are examining it in this case, and remember it was in mice, found that the mice with high blood sugar had better control once they're on a keto diet, which does make sense. You haven't actually given them any glycemic source to use to put sugar in their blood, so of course they have lower blood sugar. That's the whole point of the keto diet. This does bring us to the part of their research that is surprising and meant to be interesting. Supposedly, the animals had better aerobic capacity, or peak VO2, meaning how well the body is able to use oxygen when exercising. And this is one that we might have an answer to that's actually rather more obscure or awkward to appreciate at first glance. If you're on a keto diet, your body's going to start using protein. This does lead to a certain amount of alkalosis. The pH of your blood is directly associated with the affinity of your red blood cells for oxygen and CO2. This is something that changes as you exercise because of how the body works, meaning theoretically, you actually have a wider time frame to deal with the acidosis, as your body's already developed some modicum of adaptation, let's call it, to ketoacidosis. As a result, your body's more adapted to dealing with what happens when your body starts producing lactic acid. Now, we are going to be clear about this because that's obviously pure speculation, but it does make a little bit of sense. However, as is shown with these mice, there's no actual improvement in performance, just that there appears to be differences in how the body handles performance. Shifting to other animal-related news, we have sharks who are probably making cartels in South America very unhappy, as they're testing positive for cocaine and caffeine.
Medic!
Oh, Jesus. What is that?
Beth, we should go.
Clearly, they're skimming off the top of the cocaine deliveries, or possibly all the cocaine being dumped into the oceans after vessels are capsizing, deliveries aren't being picked up and so on, is suddenly causing the sharks to get high. The caffeine we're not so clear about. But yes, apparently researchers in the Bahamas, Brazil and Chile have found traces of caffeine and painkillers in sharks. One of the reasons thought behind this is that it could be purely down to marine pollution, and particularly marine pollution from tourism. This is bizarre to say the least. Not just because cocaine bear exists, we don't need cocaine shark, because cocaine shark is terrifying. What we do need to think about, though, is that it's more an indication of these same patterns we're seeing, say, for example, with estrogen pills and then estrogen becoming urine and urine entering the water stream, affecting fish, frogs, and so on. So it's possibly a similar event to human influence in the environment in that respect, just on an ocean scale. The research is somewhat limited, though. It was based on 85 sharks captured around Urethra. That's E-L-E-U-T-H-E-R-A, not urethra, although the two do sound somewhat similar, funnily enough. Of those 28 sharks, caffeine was the most commonly detected substance, showing that even sharks have begun to recognize the power and might of caffeine and why it is that coffee must be protected at all costs. The next is, cocaine in at least 2 of the sharks, and the researchers basically suspect what we've said, which is the sharks may have bitten into packets of cocaine that fell into the ocean. The sharks will bite things to figure out what they are, which is a somewhat aggressive form of investigation, but then again, children do exactly the same thing. You leave a child alone with something, and they will shove it in their mouth eventually, whether it is a pacifier or possibly something more dangerous. All the sharks were captured around popular diving and tourist spots, which very much indicates that a lot of this is as a result of untreated wastewater from boats, for example, or similar, and sometimes from urban development for tourism. So this does raise some pretty interesting questions going forwards as to what's going to apply when it comes to regulating things like large cruise ships and similar, although whether or not that works is a different story entirely. In further animal news that is somewhat terrifying, apparently nearly every species of scorpion in the world will glow blue under UV light, and it would appear that there are only a couple of exception species. But yes, this obviously makes it much easier to track down these terrifying little arachnids, which is great if you want to eradicate them, as you should. All arachnids are bad. But if we're talking about just a bizarre evolutionary phenomena, we have to wonder what the hell went on in terms of a selective pressure that caused them to be, treated this way. Next we have what is honestly just a somewhat hilarious mistake? Not necessarily a major mistake, just somewhat funny. Apparently, the UK is really reliving its history, as King Charles II will be visiting POTUS next month. Understand, King Charles II hasn't been around since 1865, and, his reign ended rather suddenly, and we would argue somewhat violently, after Cromwell decided that, you know what, this is not a good thing to have. We don't need a monarchy, we need a protectorate. And, King Charles II is certainly no more. Not unless the UK has mastered necromancy, in which case, congratulations? No, King Charles III will be visiting POTUS next month. In terms of things related to monarchies, tourists became locked in a church in Finland, and in order to try and escape the church, they tried tearing up cobblestones and building a ramp as though this were Minecraft. The reason they were stuck is that apparently a boom had closed and was locked, and, they wanted out. That's not how any of this works, and we are not the least bit surprised to find that they would be arrested and possibly jailed, but definitively deported, if nothing else. Apparently the Swedish news reporting agencies are far more polite about this, though, as they've effectively refused to tell us anything about the individuals and why they decided to tear up ancient cobblestones, or at least close to ancient, in an effort to try and escape something that did not require escaping, just required a call. In dumb law enforcement news, a quadruple amputee, a professional cornhole player, is facing murder charges. Apparently they are armed and dangerous. Well, somehow armed and dangerous, as they have neither arms nor legs.
So were you, in an accident or what?
No, me father was a tree.
What they're being accused of is a murder over a shooting sometime in 2026, about a week ago now. And the claim is that the professional cornhole player, and remembering this quadruple amputee, as in arms and legs have all been amputated, apparently has murdered someone and committed multiple related offences in the last week. Where this gets particularly bizarre is that apparently the quadruple amputee not only was able to shoot a gun, which we'd already call impressive, but apparently was driving a car when they did so. Frankly, if any of this holds up as true, we're going to say that they've done an impressive enough job that perhaps let them off, because if somebody's able to do all of these things despite being a quadruple amputee, we don't know what they're going to get up to in prison, because they'll probably turn into some sort of gang leader in there and turn the prison into a, horror show of productive criminality. Going on now, we have the Daily Mail actively embarrassing itself with a very dumb headline that they've since tried to correct, but the internet never forgets. The original headline read quite simply, "Women work longer hours than men." Now, correct us if we're wrong, but our understanding is that 44.8 and 45.5 are bigger numbers than 30.4 and 34. in both of these cases, we're fairly sure at least 45.5 and 44.8 is bigger than 30.4 and 34. Yet, the Daily Mail is trying to claim that women work more hours when they work 30.4 to 34 hours versus 44.8 to 45.5 hours for males. Now, again, if we're wrong, feel free to correct us, and we strongly suspect that we are right, which is why the headline has been changed, which also raises another serious issue. The editor has not left a note on this article that they have altered the headline at all, which is definitely not compliant with most editorial codes of practice, and certainly professional codes. So, yeah. Congratulations, Daily Mail, you've managed to screw up twice in one article, which is an impressive degree of ineptitude, but you are a rag, so not surprising. Going on now, we have Pi Day, and a breakthrough in the record for calculating pi. Pi Day is, well, March 14th, 3.14 if you use the American calendar, which does suck, but it could be worse. What's happened here is that apparently NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory only needed 37 decimal places to calculate the circumference of an observable universe to within the width of a hydrogen atom, which is pretty damn impressive. Utterly useless, but cool. The other thing that's been developed and announced on Pi Day is that Storage Review has been able to reclaim the pi crown of calculating it with measuring pi to 314 trillion, that's trillion with a T, digits. So yes, the approximation of pi has grown almost exponentially in the last 50 years, looking less like a hockey stick and more like a straight up line that goes from relatively progressive developments since ancient times until the 50s, where it really took off, with a couple of periods of stagnation. We presume that Vietnam War threw a real spanner in the works for a lot of this. So yes, it's a bizarre development in terms of science that is more useful, more important. Yeah, let's put it that way. There is actually an end to how many times you can clone someone or something.
Magnificent, aren't they?
It's a 20-year-long study, which we have to be honest and say does not sound that encouraging, where they've been trying to clone the same rat continuously. Japanese researchers were presumably trying to figure out how to make another Rei Yanami, and decided that rather than waste the material they have on hand and, well, possibly lose a glorious anime figure, they've chosen to use a rat. And apparently this has found that there is a limitation to how long and how far you can clone a mammal. The study began in 2005, and they've continued to reclone the clone by transferring its nuclear DNA into an egg. This egg has obviously been emptied of nuclear DNA, and after 57 generations, and roughly 1,200 mice from a single donor, they're able to say that, yes, on the 50th generation, the recloned mice had accumulated so many genetic mutations, they died the day after they were born. So, we know that it takes 56 generations before something goes wrong, or at least wrong enough to kill them right away. We do have to wonder, though, does their research provide some sort of detail on the progressive nature of the mutation accumulation, so that we can get a better idea as to whether or not it's just that after this many generations it doesn't work at all, or at certain time points you have any idea about, let's say, how significant the mutations are. Because all they really have told us so far is that at 25 generations, the recloned mice look no different to the original, and success rates were practically on par with what's there, which is great. But knowing that there's 25 generations that are successful and 57, 58 that fail, what about those in between, as there's basically a halfway mark? The research does indicate that perhaps between the 50th and 55th generation, that's when the impact becomes most notable. But that's not all that helpful just yet. In news that's concerning as well, CERN is transporting antimatter towards Germany. Now, we want to be clear about this. World War II ended in technically 1990 in the case of Germany, as we needed a way for Germany to reunify before that could be ended. But officially, most people say 1945. This is why we don't need to drop a bomb in the form of antimatter on Germany to make them surrender. They've already surrendered. It's fine. We have peace. But CERN is transporting antimatter, which, if it ever gets in contact with actual matter, will end spectacularly badly. Okay, we're being a little bit facetious there, but they are transporting a tiny amount of antimatter. Tiny amount. 92 antiprotons, and they need a 1-ton transportation trap for this. That would be like transporting 92 grains of rice, but using a Boeing 747, or even an Airbus. Well, the reason why they are transporting it is, well, partly because they want to avoid that whole antimatter-matter reaction, but also they're moving them somewhere else so they can be tested and used in research. Importantly, the actual amount of antimatter being transported isn't that much, and importantly, isn't that much even in terms of its reactivity. So even if there was something to go terribly wrong with this, and there's every possibility it might do, it wouldn't cause a massive nuclear reaction. It would just create a mess, at least in terms of the truck transporting it. The amount of antimatter being transported has the rough destructive capacity of a fraction of a stick of TNT, and we mean a very small fraction. Now, they were transporting more, obviously significantly more, and obviously relative to the amount being transported, efficacy in terms of making something go boom.
We need dark matter, and we need it fast. Fry, check Nibbler's litter box. Maybe he dropped a steamer.
Aye, aye, Captain. Yes! I've never been so excited to see poop. Well, maybe once. Yay!
There's gas in our ass!
In something going boom, ChatGPT apparently goes insane if you keep pestering it with the same input.
Jeez, I've seen lines move faster in the sperm bank.
That's for sure. Roberto, you old lunatic, how you been?
Or something to that effect, which is kind of like what happens with parents and children who keep asking why. According to some users reporting what's happened, the ChatGPT does not like this, and as a result, it begins giving more and more unhinged answers as you keep asking it, but why? Or variations thereof. This alongside a second development involving ChatGPT just eventually going down a crazy rabbit hole for no apparent reason other than it can. For example, it may start with something that's a reasonably benign and coherent response, and then become nonsensical, even occasionally going into sonnets and playwright-type speech. OpenAI did eventually respond to this, saying that the ChatGPT nonsense replies, which they have bureaucratically called unexpected response from ChatGPT, has been resolved, and that the technical staff have published a post-mortem. Apparently it was a bug with how the model processes language. Part of this is because it generates responses by sampling what is basically being presented, and then creating a probability. And because language consists of maps to everywhere and nowhere, it, bugged out. Badly. In the last piece of news we have for you this week, it's how and where and why you should or should not be using AI tools. In this case, it's somebody applying an AI checker for something they know predates AI by a massive margin, and then being surprised that the AI checker says, actually, a surprising percentage of this work is probably AI generated. Now, we will be the first to admit that yes, it's helpful to have these tools, but the tools are also notoriously unreliable, and often throw error messages when they shouldn't, or produce results that say, hey, this is AI, but it really isn't. And as a result, we would argue that it's a case of applying tools in the right way, at the right time, and with the right reasons. Not going, hey, there's this thing out there, let's test to see if it does something weird. It would be like Russian roulette. If you know the gun is unloaded, it's perfectly safe. Stupid, but safe. Whereas if you don't know if the gun is loaded, it's obviously incredibly dangerous. Or at least prospectively dangerous. In the same way, if you try and, say, use a nail gun for something that it's not going to work for, you'll get unexpected results. Or if you try and use, say, a blunt knife, again, danger, because you get unexpected results. This is why something like this, although it sounds terrible, is really more a demonstration of a failure to use a tool correctly than it is an actual problem with the tool necessarily. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.